No one on that quiet English airfield could know that within hours, history would pivot on a single decision. The men waiting beside rows of silent C-47 transport aircraft had spent months preparing for a mission many believed offered little chance of an easy return. Yet what happened before they boarded those planes would become one of the most revealing moments of the Second World War, not because of a famous speech or a dramatic order, but because of an ordinary conversation that exposed the extraordinary bond between a commander and the soldiers who trusted him. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Greenham Common Airfield in Berkshire looked calm on the surface. Transport aircraft stood ready on the runway, their cargo doors open as crews completed final inspections. Around them, hundreds of paratroopers from the 52nd Segunda Parachute Infantry Regiment made their last preparations. Faces were darkened for the night operation. Equipment weighing close to 100 pounds rested heavily on their shoulders. Every weapon, parachute, ration, and ammunition pouch had been checked countless times. There was little left to do except wait. The atmosphere was unlike what many people imagined before one of history's greatest military operations. There were conversations, quiet jokes, and nervous smiles, but also a remarkable sense of determination. These men understood the importance of their mission. They had volunteered for airborne service, completed one of the most demanding training programs of the war, and accepted that they would be dropped deep behind enemy lines long before the main invasion reached the beaches of Normandy. Then a small convoy rolled onto the airfield without ceremony. There were no waving flags, no military parade, and no formal announcement. For a brief moment, rumors spread through the camp that perhaps a Hollywood celebrity had arrived to boost morale. Instead, the man stepping from the lead vehicle was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander and the officer carrying the enormous responsibility for Operation Overlord. Less than 24 hours earlier, Eisenhower had faced the most difficult decision of his career. Poor weather had already forced one delay, and every additional day increased the risk that Germany would uncover the invasion plan. Military commanders debated forecasts, tide tables, and intelligence reports before Eisenhower quietly reached his conclusion. Okay, let's go. With those few words, millions of Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen were set in motion. Yet behind that confident decision lay private doubts few people knew about. Classified reports warned that the airborne divisions could suffer devastating losses. Another document, written by Eisenhower himself, accepted full responsibility if the invasion failed. It remained folded in his pocket as he walked across the airfield, prepared to shoulder every consequence alone. Most commanders might have chosen this moment to deliver a powerful speech filled with patriotic slogans. Eisenhower did something completely different. He simply walked among the soldiers. He asked where they came from. What they had done before the war. What they hoped to do when peace returned. It was a simple act of humanity, but it reflected a leadership philosophy unlike that of any other major army fighting in Europe. Instead of seeing uniforms, Eisenhower saw ordinary citizens who had answered an extraordinary call. What happened during those few quiet minutes would become one of the most iconic images of World War II. Yet the famous photograph captured only a fraction of the story. The real significance was not found in dramatic words or military protocol. It was found in the trust shared between one commander and the young men preparing to change history. And before the first aircraft lifted into the night sky, that trust would give Eisenhower something even the most detailed battle plans never could: confidence that the future of the Allied invasion rested in the hands of soldiers who were ready for whatever awaited them. The confidence visible on Greenham Common hid a reality known only to a handful of senior commanders. While the paratroopers checked their equipment and joked with one another, classified reports arriving at Allied headquarters painted a far darker picture of the mission ahead. Just 1 week before D-Day, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the officer responsible for coordinating the Allied airborne operation, submitted a highly classified assessment to General Eisenhower. After reviewing the latest intelligence, he believed the American airborne assault faced overwhelming obstacles. German anti-aircraft defenses had grown stronger. Reinforcements had moved into Normandy. The maze of hedgerows and flooded fields surrounding the planned landing zones threatened to scatter both paratroopers and gliders. His conclusion was deeply troubling. The operation, he warned, could suffer catastrophic losses before the soldiers even reached their objectives. For any commander, such a recommendation would have been impossible to ignore. These were not speculative fears but calculations made by the officer responsible for sending thousands of young Americans into the night sky. Some estimates suggested that entire airborne units might be unable to regroup after landing, leaving isolated groups to face experienced German defenders with little support. Eisenhower listened carefully. He never dismissed the warning, nor did he criticize the officer who delivered it. Instead, he requested every concern be documented in full. He wanted every risk understood before making what would become the defining decision of his military career. Yet another reality weighed heavily on his mind. Without the airborne divisions, the landings at Utah Beach faced enormous danger. German forces had flooded large areas behind the coastline, leaving only a handful of narrow roads leading inland. Those roads, known as causeways, had to be secured before thousands of Allied troops arrived from the sea. That responsibility belonged almost entirely to the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. If those soldiers failed to capture bridges, crossroads, and exits before dawn, the entire invasion timetable could collapse. Success on the beaches depended upon men who would already be fighting miles behind enemy lines. The decision became painfully clear. Delaying the airborne assault might reduce immediate losses, but it could place tens of thousands of soldiers arriving by sea in even greater danger. Eisenhower understood there was no perfect choice, only the responsibility to select the path that offered the greatest chance of overall success. He chose to proceed. Privately, however, the weight of that decision never left him. Before leaving headquarters on June 5, he quietly wrote a short statement accepting complete responsibility if Operation Overlord failed. The note was never intended for public view. It acknowledged that every decision had been made using the best information available and concluded with a remarkable admission: if blame were to fall on anyone, it should fall on him alone. The folded paper remained in his pocket as he drove to Greenham Common. Meanwhile, the paratroopers waiting beside the aircraft knew nothing of these private burdens. Most had no idea that senior commanders had debated whether the airborne operation should even take place. They knew only that months of relentless training had prepared them for this moment. Many were barely in their 20s. Only a few years earlier, they had been students, farmers, factory workers, mechanics, and clerks. Now they stood ready to become the first Allied soldiers to enter occupied France on D-Day. Their mission was unlike any conventional battle. They would jump into darkness, often separated from their units, carrying only what they could strap to their bodies, and rely on initiative rather than detailed instructions. Within a few hours, those ordinary citizens would be asked to accomplish extraordinary tasks under conditions no training exercise could truly recreate. The greatest invasion in military history was no longer simply a plan on maps. It was about to become reality, and every passing minute brought the moment of departure closer. As darkness settled over southern England, the waiting finally ended. Across Greenham Common, the deep roar of hundreds of aircraft engines shattered the evening silence. One after another, C-47 transport planes rolled toward the runway, each carrying 18 heavily equipped paratroopers whose mission could determine the success or failure of Operation Overlord. General Eisenhower remained on the airfield, watching every aircraft begin its takeoff. For months he had studied maps, approved plans, and weighed impossible choices. Now those decisions were beyond his control. History had left the conference rooms behind. Everything depended on the courage and judgment of the men climbing into the night sky. Inside the aircraft, there were no speeches. Most paratroopers sat quietly, adjusting parachute straps one last time. Others exchanged brief smiles or nodded silently to the men beside them. Everyone understood that once the green light appeared, there would be no turning back. As the formation crossed the English Channel, the weather became increasingly unpredictable. Clouds reduced visibility, strong winds pushed aircraft off course, and German anti-aircraft fire forced many pilots to maneuver unexpectedly. Carefully planned flight paths began to break apart. When the jump signal finally came, thousands of American paratroopers disappeared into the darkness. Almost immediately, the operation unfolded far differently than planners had intended. Instead of landing together on carefully selected drop zones, many soldiers were scattered across miles of unfamiliar countryside. Some landed in flooded fields, others in orchards, hedgerows, villages, or open farmland. Equipment containers drifted away from their owners. Radios were lost, units became separated, and many officers found themselves surrounded by soldiers they had never met before. Though an army built entirely on strict centralized control, the operation might have descended into confusion. Instead, something remarkable happened. Small groups began organizing themselves almost instinctively. A sergeant gathered nearby soldiers regardless of their unit. A lieutenant assembled whoever he could find and moved toward the assigned objective. Corporals took command when officers were absent, while individual paratroopers relied on training, initiative, and common purpose rather than waiting for new instructions. The battlefield no longer resembled the neat arrows drawn across planning maps. It became hundreds of independent missions unfolding at the same time. Every bridge secured, every crossroads defended, and every German position delayed created precious time for the invasion fleet approaching the Normandy coast. Though scattered across the countryside, the airborne soldiers continued advancing toward their objectives with remarkable determination. The greatest strength of the American airborne force was no longer its organization, it was its adaptability. Hours earlier, Eisenhower had walked among ordinary citizens wearing military uniforms. Now those same citizens were making life or death decisions entirely on their own. Their ability to think independently transformed what many feared would become disaster into a campaign that still achieved its essential objectives. As dawn broke over Normandy, the first waves of Allied infantry began landing on Utah Beach. Waiting for them were not perfectly organized airborne divisions, but countless small groups of determined paratroopers who had already disrupted German defenses, secured key routes inland, and created opportunities far beyond what anyone believed possible after such chaotic landings. At that moment, the true turning point of D-Day became clear. Victory would not depend on flawless execution. It would depend on ordinary men adapting under extraordinary pressure, proving that initiative, trust, and determination could overcome even the most carefully planned obstacles of war. By the end of June 6, 1944, it was clear that Operation Overlord had survived its most dangerous test. The airborne landings had not unfolded according to plan. Units were scattered across Normandy, communication had broken down, and countless objectives were attacked by improvised groups rather than organized formations. Yet the mission succeeded for one remarkable reason: thousands of ordinary soldiers refused to let confusion become defeat. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions adapted to every unexpected challenge. Small groups secured bridges, captured crossroads, disrupted German movements, and protected the vital causeways leading inland from Utah Beach. Their actions created the conditions that allowed thousands of Allied troops arriving from the sea to move beyond the beaches and begin the liberation of Western Europe. The cost, however, was immense. Many of the young men Eisenhower had spoken with only hours before never returned home. Others continued fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy before facing new battles in Holland, the Ardennes, and eventually deep inside Germany. They were teachers, mechanics, students, farmers, and factory workers before the war. History remembers them as paratroopers, but their greatest achievement was proving that ordinary citizens could accomplish extraordinary things when united by duty and trust. Perhaps the most powerful symbol of that day was not the famous photograph itself, but a small folded note that Eisenhower carried in his pocket. It accepted complete responsibility if the invasion failed. Fortunately, he never had to read those words publicly. The operation succeeded, not because everything went perfectly, but because countless individuals made courageous decisions when plans could no longer guide them. Years later, many veterans reflected on Eisenhower's visit to Greenham Common. They remembered that he did not deliver a dramatic speech or demand perfect military ceremony. Instead, he spoke to them as people. He asked about their hometowns, their families, and the lives they hoped to return to after the war. That simple conversation revealed a leadership style built on trust rather than fear. In many armies of the time, authority flowed through strict hierarchy alone. Eisenhower believed something different. He believed that soldiers who were respected as individuals would fight not only because they were ordered to, but because they believed in one another and in the mission they had accepted. The events of D-Day proved that philosophy under the most demanding conditions imaginable. More than 80 years later, the image of Eisenhower speaking with young paratroopers remains one of the defining photographs of World War II. At first glance, it appears to capture a commander inspiring his troops. In reality, it captured something even more meaningful, a commander drawing strength from the confidence of the men he was about to send into history. Leadership is often measured by victories, medals, or military rank. But sometimes, true leadership is revealed in a quiet conversation before the battle begins, when a leader chooses empathy over ceremony, responsibility over excuses, and trust over fear. That is why this moment continues to resonate today. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by famous generals or carefully written plans. It is shaped by ordinary people who rise to extraordinary challenges, and by leaders willing to stand beside them, sharing both the burden of success and the responsibility for failure. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more carefully researched stories from World War II, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you never miss a new episode. If this story gave you a new perspective on D-Day, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if someone in your family served during the Second World War, we'd be honored to hear their story. Every memory shared helps preserve the legacy of a generation whose courage continues to inspire the world.